inviting me. This is my first time speaking in public since 2015, before Alice, who many of you knew, took sick and died. And I'm so honored and flattered that my first talk back is for the Linden Hall Library. Thanks so much for this, Jason. 2 quick housekeeping notes. This happened when Tommy McKierney spoke about a month ago. I occasionally get the dreaded blue screen of death because of a Microsoft upgrade. If that happens, I've already told Jason I can get logged back in about 3 to 4 minutes, so just hang tight unless it's towards the end. I also have a slide at the end of the PowerPoint that I've talked to Jason about this. I will give you all access to any of the documents I'm referring to today, and plus many more that I actually got from the Northern Ireland Political Collection. I'm not putting it on the slide, but Jason, I'm going to send it to Jason and he can forward that link on to you, as well as my email address. I just didn't want to be putting my email address in that link on when it goes on to YouTube in a couple of days. So I'll be able to share it with you at the end of it. And also on that final slide will be a reading list on loyalism compiled by both Ian Turner and Sophie Long, who actually compiled lists on loyalism for reading. All right, so on that note, and I see somebody taking a selfie of me on the screen already. Okay, thank you. Okay, so on that note, I will do the shared screen and start the PowerPoint. All right, so I did name it. I chose the title of today's presentation because I've always loved Stiff Little Fingers, in particular this song, and because the concept fits with Henry Sinnerton's argument that what Gusti Spence tried to do in his political work was to establish an alternative unionism. And this topic is particularly relevant now because of, well, what just happened yesterday, the Scottish elections, the uncertainty around Brexit, the Irish sea border, the recent violence, and I would also pull in the recent surveys on identity, where Northern Irish identity is growing amongst both nationalist and unionist youth, and the resignations of Arlene Foster and Stephen Aiken, and the fracturing of traditional unionism between the hard right of unionism and the growing liberalism and secularism of young unionists. In essence, unionism and Northern Ireland find themselves at a crossroads again. This also gave me the chance to go back and review a piece I wrote in 2015. Is it time to revisit sharing responsibility, a concept developed by loyalism in this period as a way to end the violence and create an alternative Ulster. So when I was putting this together okay, the clicker, come on. There we go. When I was putting this together, preparing to talk, I figured it'd be interesting to go back to the past as a possible way forward for both unionism and Northern Ireland. Therefore, I set out to investigate particularly sharing responsibility that emerged in the early 70s, and as Jason said, could have prevented or at least mitigated many of the problems facing Northern Ireland today. So as part of the agenda today is doing a brief look at the development of politics. So we have to do a little bit of history, then the analysis that they developed, and then the political proposals they came up with, and then the conclusions I've come up with myself as related to this. So the analysis, political proposals, and the conclusions going with this. Now, today's talk focuses on the political evolution and analysis of loyalism, and there are ideas for an alternative Ulster. We can't ignore the terrible sectarian violence that loyalism carried out in these years, that they were also looking for a way to end the conflict. It needs to be spoken of. The reason I stopped in 1977 here is that they developed the core of their political philosophy and proposals in this period, and they continue to build on them over the years. I've also put a listing here, and this is all from McKittrick and McVeigh, the listing of the provisional IRA's killing in the same period to illustrate how bad this period was and what they actually did at the same time while they were trying to find a way out of the conflict. All right, so that's the setup. So what were the origins of the political thinkings? Well, it began in the early 1970s, as we're going to see a little bit later, but it was given voice by Gusti Spence in 1972 when he was on the run or kidnapped by the UVF, in which he did an interview. He said, insofar as people speak of 50 years of misrule, I wouldn't disagree with that. And he went on to talk about how they suffered, the Loyalist population suffered just as much in terms of deprivation as any other deprived people on the Falls Road or anywhere else in the world. And so what this did, it gave an awakening to other people who were thinking about this at the same time. And one person at this time said, so I was coming at the feeling we had been betrayed by unionism. So when Gusti was saying that sort of stuff, it resonated with me in terms of what was happening on the Shankill. You could see the poverty, you could touch it. At the same time, others would argue it was the inability of the state to protect the border and the Protestant working class from the IRA, as well as not taking care of them for the 50 years of what Gusti called unionist misrule. Huey Smith, when talking to him, basically argued it was like, for some people, it was like a rude awakening where he just said, hold on here. And these are Huey's words, you see, for too long, nobody ever questioned the political masters. And Roy Garland, in his work on Gusti, basically tied this together with the suspension and then the elimination of Stormont, arguing that this set loyalism and people who were beginning to think about what Northern Ireland would look like at the end, when the conflict was over, which way it would go. And they had the opportunity to think about alternative paths rather than going back to majority rule and one community ruling over top of the other one. It allowed them to think outside the railway lines of traditional unionism. And Garland pointed out, when they did come up with this, it took the form of favoring conciliation and a form of democratic socialism, which retained the link to the UK, which we will see in some of the documents we get further on. So no matter which way this awakening came, these thinkers within the UVF, Red Hand Commando, and a small group of thinkers outside the organizations began to develop an analysis of how Northern Ireland descended into violence, analyze what happened in the early 70s, and began to think of a way out of the violence. The key here, though, I want to stress is, as we will see, they were not seeking a return to Stormont, but the creation of a very different Northern Ireland with their ideas. All right, so who was this? And oh, I've almost left this out. I can't leave this. And the other issue is Spence University and the influence that Gusti had inside Long Kesh in getting young men like Billy Hutchinson, Davy Irvine, Eddie Kinner, Bino Niblock, and many others to begin to think about the conflict in a very different way and how the situation was how they could change the situation. So working class politics, okay, who was this small group? Well, Billy Mitchell in the Principles of Loyalism argued that in the early 70s, a number of key figures in the UVF began to engage with the Northern Ireland Labour parties, one of whom was the late Reverend John Stewart of the Woodville Methodist Church. Reverend Stewart met regularly with the senior members, according to Mitchell, and during the next few years encouraged them to think in terms of bread and butter politics, as well as the constitutional issue. He also encouraged them to respond to republicanism through nonviolence and dialogue. And as he points out, a number of UVF members who met with Stewart had labor or trade union background and were open to working class politics and moderate unionism he was espousing. Billy Hutchinson remembers that it was Reverend Stewart, David Overand, and Jimmy McDonald, along with Huey Smith, who began the heavy work and the heavy lifting on the outside in terms of new politics. And we will see the fruits of their work in later documents. Now, one of the other things we can't leave out is Gusti. And people who have studied this or read my book or read Garland's book know that one of the key questions he asked prisoners coming into Long Kesh was, "Why are you here, son?" And he would get the standard answer, "I would pleaded guilty or carrying explosives with intent to do harm," or whatever other the charges were. And Gusti would always go, "No, no, 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 no. What circumstances in life led you here?" And when asked by Peter Taylor what he was doing, Gusti said, what I wanted to do was provoke them into thinking about why they were there. Not defense. That was only a manifestation of why they were there. I wanted to know the reasons why they were there, what led them to there. And as we know, he set up formal and informal education, and it became known as Spence University. Encouraged arts and crafts, encouraged open university, encouraged A levels, O levels, and many Loyalist prisoners came out with degrees at the end of the day. And one of the documents pointing that out, I actually have online for you as well. They had study huts, debating huts. And there's a story that Davy Irvine told to Henry Sinnerton when one day they were in the hut chatting, and Gusti came by and said, open the door, and it was like throwing a hand grenade in. He said, what if the provosts are right? And his goal here was to provoke them. All right, now you have to understand the provisional IRA's point of view. You have to know why they're fighting and what their argument is, so you can develop your argument and be able to explain why you were fighting and what you hope to achieve. So it was also about forcing them to engage in understanding the other side, but also learning how to engage in dialogue. And Gusti was all about encouraging dialogue. Now, what did they come up with through the studies inside Long Kesh and out? Well, the concept was they realized that they had grown up in a sick society. Gusti famously said in a speech in 1977, the political prisoners and paramilitaries cannot be made scapegoats for our society's ills, because ours was a sick society long before the fighting men came on the scene. It was only when it was tested that the scabrous cracks began to show through. David Irvine, when he met with my class in 2004 over the internet, along with Monica McWilliams and Philip McGuigan, said, did stinking polluted politics come before paramilitarism? I think the answer to that is yes. And Billy Mitchell said, we didn't get to Peter Taylor. We didn't go to bed one night as ordinary family men and wake up the next morning as killers. Conditions were created in this country whereby people did things they shouldn't have done. And so through this analysis and through what they were learning, they began to examine the society they came from. And as Sarah Nelson pointed out in Ulster's Loyal Defenders, experience forced them to ask, suppose some of the things that the Catholics say are true, and suppose we have some things in common. Where does that leave our political ideology? And as we will see, it forced them to rethink the entire nature of Northern Ireland and how to restructure it to end the conflict and create a functioning system acceptable to all. And this moves us into where they began the political analysis in the program. And many of you have seen this mural on the Shankill Road to Huey Smith. And he gave me a similar quote from my book. But looking at it, understanding that both Protestant and Catholic were both fed different narratives, but in reality, as he puts it here, we were all third-class citizens and none of us realized it. When he told me a similar quote, he finished it off, we were all third-class citizens and nobody gave a damn about us. And that was the way he put it there. So now they've got to figure out, they're on their own. The elimination of Stormont set them free so they can begin to think about an alternative Ulster. Now, one of the things I need to address as well, because it came up a number of times when the book first came out, is why didn't I do anything on the UDA? Well, because of my work circumstances and time constraints, I was not able to study the UDA. But you can see two of their main documents here. And if you want to, Common Sense is actually on the Kane archive and you can read it there. And you can click through on the history of the UDA, because I will be making this PowerPoint available to you as well on that website. So you can use that and click through on it. And one thing I want to point out here is the quote on the image, or under Common Sense. And this is from John McMichael. We must share the responsibility for finding a settlement and share the responsibility of maintaining a good government. We can see that the UDA at this time was working towards a society that shared responsibility in the same way that the Red Hand, UVF, and Progressive Unionist Party will argue in the proposals that begin to emerge in this period as well. The idea, again, was not to share power, it was to share responsibility. And we begin to see this as early as 1973 in the Red Hand Commandos version of Loyalist News. There was also a UDA Loyalist News. The proposals were part of a larger article in the Loyalist News, and the writers had concluded that there were real changes in the Dublin government and in the SDLP at this period, and that compromise was now possible. And as a result, they put forward ideas: a ceasefire of all paramilitary groups for 6 months, then release of all internees, 3 months later an amnesty, decommissioning, and no actions by the Army and RUC, with the idea that there would be negotiations at the end of this cooling off period. As one of the people that I interviewed for this said, who was involved with this, said basically our idea was your first thing was your ceasefires, then your talks, and then your agreement. That was the way things were going to have to function. And when they put these proposals out in the essay, they argued it will not be one force that will dictate the terms for a ceasefire, nor politicians alone. It must be done with the cooperation of all concerned in the struggle for the survival of Ulster. They've accepted that the conflict, the troubles have stalemated. Nobody is going to be able to win this, so we're going to have to find a way to work out of this and then reconstruct the society on a fundamentally new basis. And as part of this, in the same year, in August of '73, in the proposals for the Assembly, arguing for integrated education, they published this, in which they called for a parliamentary act to end segregated education, claiming it would be in years to come remembered as the greatest public act since the abolition of slavery. We're going to see this recurring in the documents that I'll be referring to later in sharing responsibility. And it's going to move to the point where they argue that religion and politics must be parted forever. Religious education should be taken out of the state schools. And if you wanted to have a religious school or a public school on the British English version, then those would have to be publicly funded. And if you wanted religious education, go into your churches or do it in the home, but it should not be the place of the schools in the integrated education. They don't say that at this point here, but that will come along, that will come in later proposals. At the same time, in February of 1974, under a leadership that begun to see, as they put it in a series of articles in the Sunday News, that they now saw that life in Ulster could only be enjoyed in the full by the creation of a new society based upon the unity and sovereignty of the ordinary rank and file Ulster people, Protestant and Catholic alike. And this is what they were calling it. So it's clear that they're already thinking in terms of some sort of compromise and looking at it from a point of view coming together of the working class population of both communities. As you can imagine, I don't have time to go in it right now, but they were attacked unmercifully by the far right, accused of going communist, selling out Northern Ireland, and on and on and on. I can talk more about that later, but it would take me off topic right here. So that's an important statement. In the same year, it was the East Antrim Workers' Council published this, but from my understanding, Billy Mitchell was heavily involved in writing this, and it was called Combat Violence. And the first line in it was to combat the violence of the provisional IRA, the senseless bombings, murders, and mutilations. But it also called on combating the violence of the security forces, the dawn swoops and wrecked homes, the Kinsonian torture, and the distraught wives and heartbroken mothers. It also called for combating poverty, combating poor housing, combating no housing, combating unemployment, combating repression, and combating non-jury trials. And one of the key ones that he said was to combat the violence of sectarianism the division of community for political gain, the murder of citizens on account of their religion, and paid sectarian mercenaries of the upper middle class Tories. This at a time when the Loyalists were beginning to outkill the Provisional IRA in 1974, in 1975. It is, on one hand, they were doing this on the outside, but on the other hand, they were also thinking about what we need to get out of this, to get out of the conflict. And this takes us to where they start really putting documents together and real proposals. It appeared in Loyalist News by, from what I understand, it came from the Red Hand Commando as well, from people within the UVF discussing this document both inside and outside of Long Kesh. And it was called within the context of Northern Ireland. They called for a new constitution, sorry, puberty, a new constitution guaranteeing human rights and social justice. Obviously calling for continued union with Britain. It looked for a mixed economy, encouraging state intervention in key sectors of the economy, but also encouraging, entrepreneurship. It looked for cooperation with the Republic on the basis of friendship. It called for equal right to employment, absolutely no discrimination. And in another way of avoiding competition for scarce resources, it also wanted to, if possible, full employment, which they also, as was in another document, saw would be a way of avoiding competition for jobs, which encouraged sectarianism or exacerbated sectarianism. Freedom from religion, freedom of religion, worship however you please, and not ever having to be worrying about whether you're a Catholic or Protestant or whatever you choose to be. Again, integrated education, okay? Religion, and this, they stated clearly here, religious schools and public schools to finance themselves and not rely on state money. Religious education taken out of the schools, and religion and politics to be parted forever. And so called for social housing programs to deal with the poor housing. Those of you who grew up in Belfast in the early 60s and 70s and know Ron Wiener's book on the rape and plunder of the Shankill know how bad housing was in this period. And the idea, as one person I talked to was involved in this, was this. What we wanted to do was, these are his words, what we wanted to do was construct some principles on what society would be based. And the first one was a society that would have to be a pluralist one. It would have to be free from paramilitarism, and it had to have human rights for all, and it had to be a political system that was fair and just for all, and would have to have a police service that was fair for all and not just one section of the community. So you can see where their thinking was going, and you can see how Roy Garland would argue it moved towards conciliation and to a form of democratic socialism. In the same period, this was the lead up to the convention elections in October of 74. The Volunteer Political Party, which the UVF created to run in that election, and it overlaps with the Red Hand Commando document, and accepted the concepts of sharing responsibility, which were already emerging, and the idea of the constitutional structures within the context of Northern Ireland. And what they also did was they called for parity with Scotland and Wales. And they stated in here clearly that Northern Irish, even the Ulster Unionists, Loyalists, always had sort of an inferiority complex with Scotland and Wales, and they wanted to be treated the same as those nations with the United Kingdom. They argued no to United Ireland, obviously, but they also argued against no to unilateral declaration of independence. And they stated clearly the reason for that is they did not want to be pulled out of Britain and then have less jobs there and exacerbate the sectarian tensions for the competition for jobs. Obviously, looking for positive changes in justice and policing away from the no jury courts, and policing to be normalized and not be doing exactly what Billy Mitchell mentioned in terms of the break-ins and the heavy-handed security presence. Securing the politically and economically with the UK in order to basically improve the economy, to hopefully take away some of the reasons for the violence. And again, social issues, more power to resist social service cuts. However, as we do know, when they stood in the elections in 1974, they got hammered at the polls and lost their deposit. And with that failure, the UVF left. The UVF, after a leadership change, pulled back from politics, although the working and work and thinking went on, albeit about a small group of people inside and outside of Long Kesh. And the UVF went back to defending Ulster's place in the United Kingdom. And as we know, Kerry, 1974 and 75 were two of the worst years in terms of sectarian murders being carried out by the Loyalist paramilitaries. And this is an important note because when politics failed in this period, people died. And that's something to keep in mind as we look at what as they were trying to work their way out of the conflict. All right. Now, this is a bit of a, not a small digression, but it's a digression that needs to be taken. And I was talking to Jason about this before he let everybody in. And this is a speech that Gusti gave on the 12th of July, 1977. If you've read my book, I did a whole section on it. I have the original typed version as copied for you. That is also going to be in the document archive that you'll have access to. And this speech is very important. It was a key intervention by Spence. During the stasis of this period, after the failure of the Volunteer Political Party, the failure to get their thoughts through to anyone, and trying to move things forward to end the conflict. And it reflected his thinking and those around him inside Long Kesh that he was working with outside on documents. And it had been foreshadowed by an essay in Combat in 1975 entitled The Futility of Violence. There was no byline, but I'm assuming Gusti had some role in writing it or was influenced by it or influenced it. And seeking to conduct our political and religious battles primarily by violent means, we have been defeating ourselves internally. Political and sectarian violence, and for that matter, institutionalized violence, is wholly inconsistent with the goals of freedom in society, the value of human life, and the dignity of an individual. Following up on this thinking, Spence laid out in his speech what he saw as the problems and his vision for ending the conflict. And he was speaking for himself, and he stated that clearly in the speech. He criticized unionist politicians who demanded victory over the IRA as bigots and fascists. He stated, "Do they not realize that the IRA was a natural manifestation of Catholic fears, just as the UVF and UDA were born from Loyalist fears?" He criticized what he saw as the regressive elements in the UVF, telling them that no fascist or bigot can accept sympathy or understanding in the UVF. Towards the end of his speech, Spence stated that the politicians could not give them the peace they so earnestly desired. So he called, and I quote, "upon all paramilitaries, all the warring factions to call a universal ceasefire, to open up dialogue with each other in order to pursue ways and means of making such a ceasefire permanent. Dialogue will have to come about sometime, so why not now? There is no victory in Ulster, not for the IRA, not for the UVF, the police, or the army. There is only victory for humanity and common sense." As we know, it took 17 more years for that to be, for the representatives of the paramilitaries to be able to start coming around the table to work out a compromise peace that came out in the form of the Good Friday Agreement. And this was followed up by an essay published in Combat the next month called Think or Parish, written by Billy Mitchell and Billy Hutchinson. And they realized, in other words, it was Think or Parish. And they argued that human intellect must now be employed for the salvation of our fair province. We must think our way out of the current present political dilemma. To continue in meaningless violence is far too dangerous. It is think or die. Since there will be no victors in this bitter war of attrition, the only battleground is in the mind and around the conference table. So this is the thinking that's going in this period. And it's going to be important because we do know, even though the VPP failed in '74, there were discussions going on, and there was work on documents taking place. And the first version of sharing responsibility comes out in 1977 by a group called the Independent Unionist Group, which was the forerunner to the Progressive Unionist Group, which was the forerunner to the Progressive Unionist Party. And it was called Devolution, the Plan for Ulster. It didn't have a full-blown working out because it was a discussion document. It called for sharing responsibility, something that Billy Hutchinson and Henry Senator agree was being touted in Long Kesh under Spence, and it saw the light of day in the early 70s inside Long Kesh, in Kesh. Spence said as early as 1973, the UVF suggested itself that there should be shared responsibility in any settlement. What is interesting, a bit of a sideline, is a document that came out a number of years ago that Billy Mitchell had typed up about the meeting that took place between the Provisional IRA and the UVF in the early 1974. The UVF used the term that they accepted the principle of equal responsibility in government. And the idea, as Plum Smith put it, we were talking about sharing responsibility because it's not about sharing power, it's about sharing responsibility. And Spence himself told Garland, sharing responsibility must be our aim in order to create a society in which everyone can realize their aspirations and walk forwards in dignity, pride, and equality. All right, and then we have the issue of proportional representation, which we now know is being used in the elections for the Stormont Assembly and for the Stormont Assembly, the assembly founded by the Good Friday Agreement. And what we do see, it comes under the title of the Progressive Unionist Group, which becomes the PUP. It's published as a separate document called the Proposed Democratic Devolved Administration. And here's a copy of it right here. You will have access to this as well. It called again for sharing responsibility, proportional representation. Again, it basically said a Bill of Rights for the entire UK. Because if you're going to create an assembly where you're going to share responsibility, and it's going to be based on proportional representation, you also need somebody looking over to make sure there are no abuses. And they saw that as the Bill of Rights, not just for Northern Ireland, but the entire UK. All right. And they called for freedom of religion again, end to all discrimination, and dealing with political prisoners. And as we know, the concept of the Bill of Rights was way ahead of its time, because even though there was a proposal put forward in 2008, there still is no Bill of Rights. There is one thing that they also put up there. They wanted to build an Israeli-type wall between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. And obviously that in no way can be considered a progressive proposal, but it is notable that it did not appear again in any of their documents they published from this point forward. But this is the idea behind it. Now, they even published a schematic of how it would work. And they argued that this was more for a discussion document, and they were very flexible on this. And I'm very aware of the time. I'm getting close to the end here. This was a discussion document, and committees would be assigned by proportional representation. It would be 153 members, and the speaker would be from the majority community, and then the deputy speaker would be from the minority community. And in the present era, as identities become more diffuse in Northern Ireland, this actually has some really interesting, could be very interesting in the present era. And one of the things that's important, I want to point out, they also called for the co-opting of civil society into the committee work. in which they argued that we bring the civic community into the committee work to get everyone sharing responsibility. They wouldn't have voting rights, but they would be able to be brought in dealing with education, social services, employment, whatever, based on their knowledge. And this way, bringing everyone into the sharing of responsibility rather than the sharing of power in this society. All right. And then there's a couple other documents in the early 80s, but I cut them out because of limitations on time. But the final, not the totally final version of sharing responsibility, but the title sharing responsibility comes out in 1985, around the time of the Anglo-Irish Accord. And they declared themselves the only socialist unionist party in Northern Ireland, committed to restoring consensus politics back into the region. And in their opening statement, they rejected a return to the past, and they recognized that there are two legitimate aspirations in Northern Ireland. But the most impressing and immediate aspirations have been totally neglected. They called for freedom from fear and violence, freedom from social deprivation, freedom from negations of basic human rights, and they dealt with many other issues. And they argued that the result of not dealing with those problems had been catastrophic. They put forward again ideas that they had developed in '79, but they called for the Northern Ireland Assembly to be broader part of local government. Instead of having cabinet-style government, the committees working through the Central Committee, which you can read the document because it's going to be up there, it would function more through committee work rather than having a cabinet system. It would also work with cross-border cooperation and again, a Bill of Rights. And they argued to guarantee fairness and address the worries of the majority about Northern Ireland's constitution, position. It called for a committee of 8 judges, 2 from the UK, 2 from the Republic of Ireland, 2 from Northern Ireland, and 2 from the European Court to oversee any Bill of Rights. Anticipating the creation of the Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission, the PUP called for the creation of a local office in Belfast where rights issues could be discussed with some urgency with a view to local conciliation. Okay, so these are the things that they're coming out, and it's evolving, but this was also, they left a lot up for discussion as ways of working it out. Then in 1986, in response to the Anglo-Irish Accord, they published War, Peace, Conflict, or Conference. Obviously reject the Anglo-Irish Accord, would not accept joint authority without consent, but they continued to reiterate the proposals they had made since 1977. And integrated non-sectarian education, cross-border participation, cooperation, and sharing responsibility. And one of the interesting things were they were looking to have normal politics brought to Northern Ireland. Bring the British Labour Party over here and have them run for elections as the Labour Party rather than being their sister party, the SDLP in Northern Ireland. Extend the British party system to Northern Ireland and try to normalize politics there. That was one of their arguments. This one I'll just touch on briefly. In '87, the PUP and the representatives of the UDA participated in discussions on alternatives to the Anglo-Irish Accord. What was agreed was there would be no return to majority rule, that they would accept alternative visions for Northern Ireland existing in and outside the UK, but power sharing and compromise would be part of it. But when it was sent to James Molyneux and Ian Paisley, according to Hughie Smith, when he talked to Frank Millar Jr. and Harold McCusker, basically they binned it. As in Hughie's words, they just binned it. And Graham Walker from Queens argues they did so because report proved too radical for party leaders in its willingness to consider power sharing and to consider devolved government outside the UK. And as we know, with this failure, after 1987, the peace process as we know it is now viewed as a Republican nationalist-driven peace process. Okay. Last 2 slides. All this work I would argue, and I could be wrong, anticipates the changes that have taken place within the unionist community, especially amongst those under the age of 40. And a system like sharing responsibility may be something that might have worked better as we've seen the evolution of issues of identities. And Peter Sherlow in 2017, when he spoke to Sinn Féin's Ardèche, told them that the majority of Protestants overall supported equal marriage. And then he went on to tell them that the majority of Protestants under the age of 40 are more supportive of equal marriage, a woman's right to choose, mixed marriages, and integrated education than Sinn Féin voters, from the studies they did at Liverpool University. This shift in attitudes is also reflected in recent data on social attitudes and identity. In essence, the attitude of young people in the unionist community could be argued have caught up to the type of society envisioned in sharing responsibility. So,
thank you for
my conclusions. Okay, I'm actually getting done with a few minutes left for questions. The conclusions, back to the future. Well, we know that, sorry, ahead of myself. We know that these people who were doing this thinking and developing these policies accepted that unionist rule had been 50 years of unionist misrule. Within loyalism and unionism, they led the way in thinking of a way to achieve a just and equitable compromise peace that involved, if you can see my paper, all is in capital letters, all factions, and put forward a practical proposals to reconstruct this Northern Ireland on a new and inclusive basis that would have protected the rights and aspirations of all in Northern Ireland. They did this, I would argue, as Volker Berghan did in his study of mass violence in the 20th century, in the understanding that we all have the ability to descend into barbarism. Then, like Berghan, they accepted if that analysis is correct, then in Berghan's words, the social milieu and the ideological and legal context become all the more important in constructing a just and fair society. But as we know, these ideas went nowhere. Now, Northern Ireland unionism and loyalism lurch from one crisis to another, as evidenced by recent events. And the Protestant working class and loyalism find themselves marginalized with little or no political voice. Now, this may be me being a little bit trying to finish on a more upbeat note, but I thought about this morning when I did another revision. So still, for me, there's a bright side. As we see the emerging attitudes with the voting patterns of young people in Northern Ireland, and in particular young unionists, maybe they have caught up to the ideas outlined here. Maybe it's time to revisit sharing responsibility. Thank you for your time and kind attention, and I'll leave it open to Jason for forwarding questions or comments.
Thank you very much, Tony, for that hugely engaging presentation. And you actually answered the question that I had at the very end there, which was about the future and going forward, because I listened today to the Talkback show on BBC Radio Ulster, which was talking really about the future of unionism. And one of the voices really missing from the whole conversation was political loyalism. And even from the people phoning in, nobody mentioned political loyalism as part of that equation. But I think you summed it up there pretty well. I've got one question which I want to kick off with, and then there are a couple in the chat function, and that might be enough to do us for the few moments. But you mentioned quite a number of key figures there: Gusti Spence, Hugh Smith, Plum Smith, Billy Mitchell, David Irvine. They all, of course, have one thing in common, and that they're all now no longer with us. But I wonder, what sort of void do you think that these people have left within loyalism and even unionism more generally today?
Yeah, I mean, when you look at it, I mean, you still have people like Billy Hutchinson around, Eddie Kinner, Marty Snodden, Bino and the rest who are doing a lot of work. But it was a void. I mean, as I've talked about this, my students asked this question, is imagine where provisional republicanism would have been if Martin McGuinness and Jerry Adams and Danny Morrison had died before they had moved the provisional IRA to where they had moved. What would have happened if these men would have been able to live longer? The other issue, though, to part of that, even if they had lived, the problem was getting to be able to bring their own organizations and their own communities with them. And that was a problem that they had that they were not really able to overcome. And I remember talking to somebody, I can't use their name, who we were talking about Gusti in particular. And he said, well, look, what happened with Gusti is Gusti, by the time Gusti was over here and the rest of the UVF was back here. And at that point, you're not leading anymore. You're too far out in front of you. So that's one of the problems they've always faced, is being able to bring their community along with them and getting people to vote. Okay. Somebody just gave me, somebody just gave me the information on how to get away from the blue screen of death. Sorry about that. But so they were no longer leading, but the community's not come with them, and their organizations didn't come with them. So yeah, but it's a void. They're not here, but they also would have had a really hard time bringing their communities with them.
Great. So we have a question here from Niall, who says, thanks, Tony, for very valuable talk and interesting work. He says, do you have any evidence of UVF contact in the 1970s with peace scholars such as John Burton or others?
Yeah, that I don't have. Actually, the people, I'll turn this over to people who are still alive. Like, I know Billy's here today. I don't have any evidence of it, but Billy Hutchinson might have some news information for you, or people like Eddie Kinner or Marty Snodden. I just don't have any information there.
Grant, no worries. And we have a question here just finally from Mary Kiley. Mary, that's quite a long-winded one. Do you want to unmute yourself and ask that question? I'll trust you to unmute yourself and ask the question if you can for us.
Okay. Thank you. And I think towards the end there, actually, Tony, you may have answered it for me. This has been a fascinating talk. My question was, why do you think it all went so wrong? Was it that there were too many people who, in fact, did want to focus on power rather than responsibility? And was Westminster perhaps too unwilling to give responsibility to paramilitaries from either side, and they wanted to hang on to their power?
Yeah, I mean, actually, yeah, that's a great question. Actually, now you have to go by my book, okay? So, but because actually, I have the one chapter which is called "Darkness at the End of the Tunnel," which actually it deals with it, and there's a number of issues. They got attacked when they started coming out with their political thinking in the early to mid 70s. They were attacked unmercifully in the newspapers. There was a series of letter writers condemning them for being communist. The group Terra that McGrath formed went after them as calling them, they'd gone over to the other side. There were issues. It came out in combat, and Colin Wallace, who is a problematic figure, argues that even with the UVF, they began to think that there were people working to undercut their political enterprise within the security services. At one point in one of their journals, they argued people were being killed in areas where there's no way they could have known what their religious background was. Who's behind that? And that actually ties into that quote from Billy Mitchell that I read, faceless mercenaries. And Colin Crawford, who did work on Defenders and Criminals, he actually argued exactly what you said, that the established forces were not going to see, quote unquote, two sets of gunmen running the country. And again, the problem was within their own community and their own organizations bringing them on board. So there was a great number of great number of reasons why it didn't go forward. And so in a sense, and in the period, the other argument was, as long as the IRA violence was going to continue, they vowed they were going to have to continue. And then I do know that within the UVF, the argument was the tail could not be wagging the dog. The military could not be being wagged by the political. I hope that's it. Okay. Thanks,
Tony. And with time just for maybe one more to squeeze in here from Calvin. I'm asking this one blind, by the way, because I don't know the origins of it, but he's asking, Can you ask why American-based Irish studies programs are hesitant to look at the Loyalist narrative?
Because there's no future in it. I mean, all seriousness, I mean, I use it. He's actually here today, a friend of mine from Indiana. He tried to sign on to get into graduate programs at a couple major American universities with Irish studies, and he wanted to study loyalism. They told him there's no future in it, and there's no reason to study it. We can argue that there's a bias in Irish because of Irish America, whatever. But the other issue for many people, the view is you're dealing with the bad guys. That would have been the way of looking at. They would have been looked at as the bad guys. Why do you want to look at the bad guys? Because of the narrative of unionist death squads and things like that. And that is in there. But and all joking aside, and there's two other people here, and I can see Rachel on the screen and Aaron Hinson, and they can tell you from their work as well that you're not taken as seriously, or people not that you're taken seriously, but it's like, let's keep it in the corner. Let's not talk about that. Okay, you're not supposed to be associated with that. And I mean, I got attacked. I actually got called in a book that came out about a year after my book came out. I was accused, and I quote, of working to a police agenda. Okay, and to undercut Sinn Féin and the Republican contribution to the peace process. So I was attacked as a police agent because I had gone in and investigated the political aspect of loyalism.
That's not a bad way to finish there, Tony. You might want to just plug your book there to finish. Do you want to just plug your book?
All right, yeah. Okay, yeah. Oops, this is a really tattered version. Okay, this is actually the book, Northern Ireland Lost Opportunity. Can I briefly tell the significance of the cover?
Of course.
I didn't design it. The person at Pluto Press designed it, and they sent it to me, and I actually cleared it with Gusti's family. It's actually a photograph of Gusti's funeral, and it's carrying him off the lost opportunity. Okay, and Gusti going. The other thing, and I don't know if he had it in mind, but we all know the phrase, "We shall never forsake the blue skies of Ulster for the grey mists of an Irish Republic." Gusti's funeral, blue skies in Ulster, in Northern Ireland, in October, and the white clouds. So I kind of thought whoever did this knew what they were doing. And I don't know who did the cover, but I thought it was brilliant. Okay, and Gusti's family gave me the okay to go along with it.
Well, thanks again, Tony. And on behalf of the Lindenhall Library, thank you for putting so much effort into tonight's talk. And thanks to everyone who's come out this evening to see it. It's been another great audience, another lively audience, another engaged audience, I'm pleased to say. Please do check out the Lindenhall Library's website. We have quite a few online events coming up between now and the end of the month, and it will be great to see some, if not all of you there at those events. So again, we've recorded tonight's event. I'm just about to hit the stop button. I will email everyone in the next day or two, maybe just with the link for the YouTube, and you can share that with anyone who wasn't able to make it tonight. So once again, thanks very much, and I hope to see you all soon.
Thank you all, folks. Thanks for coming. Bye. Thank you. Okay. Jason, I'll send you the link in my email address, and you can forward it on to everybody who registered.
We'll do that. No problem. Thanks, Tony. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks all. Bye.